This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, welcome and thanks to those of you who joined us. This is the Metropolitan Water District Representative Caucus and special meeting of the West Base Municipal Water District Board of Directors on this date of December 8th. And it's now 12:31, and I will now call the meeting to order. If I can find a gavel. I don't seem to have one handy, but the meeting is now in order. And first of all, we will have a roll call.
Yes, President Williams. Director Houston. Director Gray. Director Alvarez. Director Deere.
Here.
President Williams.
Here.
President Williams, we do not have a quorum. However, today we do not have any action items. They are all information items, so we can proceed with those items.
Well, let's proceed. And first up is the public comment.
President Williams, we have not received any requests for public comment, though I do see that we have a number of members of the public if they'd like to speak.
Okay, then we move on to discussion items. And what I'm going to do here, Mr. General Manager, I'm going to give control of item 4 to you so that you can go ahead and proceed, sir.
Yes, thank you very much, President Williams. And today we do have a trio of excellent speakers from Metropolitan Water District here to present items, 2 of which are under our discussion items. The first item that we have is item 4A, a presentation on Integrated Resources Plan by Dimitri Parzos. He is the Resources Planning Team Manager there at Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. Dimitri, welcome.
Thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I see that these slides are up, so I'll just go ahead and get started. Thanks for having us here today. I want to talk to you all about our the progress we've made on the IRP, the Integrated Water Resources Plan, give you an update of where we are in that process, and kind of some of our next steps as we finish up this first phase that we're calling the needs assessment phase, or the findings, and as we move into the implementation phase. So if we can go to the next slide. Great, so as many of you probably know, the Integrated Water Resources Plan, or IRP, is our long-term planning tool. We kind of consider it our blueprint for Southern California's water reliability. Basically, we're looking out 25 years down the road, seeking to balance our supplies and demands. And when we first started this back in the mid-90s, we were groundbreaking and with this philosophy of diversifying our portfolio. So not just relying on our imported supplies, but really leveraging those with transfers, exchanges, and storage programs. And then also looking at what we can do more locally with respect to local supply development and production, groundwater recovery, recycling, conservation, and other local supply development. Go ahead to the next slide. So that theme carries through today and all subsequent IRPs, this diversification. But what we did do differently going in this current IRP is acknowledging and a humbling fact that we cannot predict the future. And so we embraced not necessarily a new technique, but new for us, which is scenario planning. That way we could broaden our view of the future and get a better sense of what could come our way instead of trying to predict one single future. So we started that process a few years back. We identified, the first step we did was, and working in collaboration with the member agencies, the board, and other stakeholders, to identify these uncertainties that drive supplies and demands. And they're just categories are here, but there are many uncertainties that can affect and push and pull at supplies and demands. I'll go ahead to the next slide. So we developed those, or identified those, and came up with a framework of developing the scenarios. So we looked at, on one axis, looking at demands on Metropolitan, and it should be noted that part of that, or embedded in demands to Metropolitan, is assumptions on, or a range of, local supply production. So that's built into this analysis as well. On the other axis, we have supplies or imported supply stability, in Metropolitan's imported supply stability. So you have a range of those. Greater supplies, imported supply stability, you can think of that as a future with less climate change impacts, a future with less regulatory impacts, for example. On the other spectrum, other side, less imported supply stability, those would be futures that have higher climate change impacts and higher regulatory impacts. So you can see we developed 4 scenarios. Scenarios A and C, for example, are scenarios with low demands on Metropolitan, futures with low demands. Scenarios B and D have futures with higher demands. What makes A and B different from each other is, their demands are different, but what makes them the same, what's the same there, is the assumptions on imported supplies, where we have more stable imported supplies in those 2 scenarios. Contrast that with scenarios C and D, where you have less imported supply stability. So again, that gave us 4 distinct scenarios, or what we like to refer as plausible futures that we're planning for. Go ahead to the next slide. Now, this is for illustration purposes here, but it gives you a sense that with these 4 distinct scenarios comes 4 different levels of demands relative to each other, and how we fill those demands going forward between imported and storage supplies and local supplies is very different based on those drivers. So you have very different amounts that we are able to project out based on all those uncertainties that we evaluated. And what that gives you is different levels of gaps. And that helps us then understand or frame what our problem is, our reliability challenges are going into the future. So again, this is more cartoonish to kind of give you an illustration of what our end product is. The next slide here gives you a sense of the actual numbers, the magnitude and frequency. So you can see in our scenario A, we actually turned out to be reliable. We did not identify a gap given the assumptions that we made for in that scenario. And again, as a reminder, that's a scenario, a future where there are lower demands on Metropolitan, all the things that drive lower demands, whether it's water use efficiency, water use ethic, lower demand growth, and what have you. But at the end of the day, no reliability issues in scenario A. But what we do see is that we start seeing reliability issues in all the other scenarios at varying degrees and at very different timing and frequency. So you can see in scenarios B and C, 68,000 acre feet supply gap in scenarios C, for example, in the near term, and that we could expect, the analysis is showing us 1% of the time we would have that level of reliability challenge. In the longer term for scenario C, that jumps up to a 5% frequency of up to 200,000 acre feet. And again, this is without taking actions. So this again gives us a sense of the problem we're trying to solve. Scenario B has its range of reliability challenges and the frequency shown there. And really striking in scenario D, you can see that in the near term, about 2% of the time, we would expect challenges of up to 260,000 acre feet in the near term in that scenario with all the assumptions behind it. But in the longer term, we would expect up to 1.2 million acre foot gap in a future with higher demands and reduced imports. So this is a future where growth is occurring at a higher clip. Perhaps the water use ethic is waning in the region, and our imported supplies are being challenged, both through climate change and other regulatory impacts. So in that scenario, again, up to 1.2 million acre foot supply gap in supply and demands balances, and then that occurs more than half the time. So clearly, there are challenges that we're facing, and this has given us a great foundation from which to plan for. And so we also took this one step further and identified in this analysis for this first phase of the IRP, we looked at a high level, the mix of types of supplies or storage that we would need to satisfy these gaps. Again, we stopped short in the first phase of identifying specific projects. but rather we provided a sense of the mix of, say, core supplies that we would need. Core supplies being those that we can rely on year after year. And also a sense of how much storage, if any new storage is needed, and also how much we would be comfortable relying on in a given year to look and seek for new supplies in that current year. An example of that would be things like transfer supplies. So we provided that level of detail in this first phase. Go ahead to the next slide. So all of this effort, identifying the drivers, creating the scenarios, and all the analysis that went into determining our reliability, all of that through a collaborative process led us to a set of findings that we're going to use as a deliverable as for this first phase of the IRP. And those findings fell into roughly 7 categories that are listed here. I'm going to give you guys the highlights of those findings, but before I do, what this first phase does is sets us up for is the basis for the implementation plan. Go ahead to the next slide. And really briefly on the implementation plan, this will be kicked off next year. Similar in the process as the first phase, where we will have board oversight, collaboration with the member agencies. We'll have other stakeholders involved, collaborating with them as well, and the public. But really this phase then takes what we have identified as the problem and then looks at how to solve the problem. So the work that we've done to date, again, is an effort to really define what the problem is. Can't solve a problem unless you really understand what you're trying to solve. So I think we've done that in this first phase, and the implementation phase would then run with that and then get into the specific actions, specific projects, and the timing of those, and move those forward as part of the implementation. We talk a lot about the adaptive management plan. What that is referring to is we're going to be able, with the work that we've done to date and additional work in the next phase, identify the things we need to look for to give us a sense of when we need to pull the trigger on certain actions. We look at it as 2 buckets. There's robust actions or common actions that work across all scenarios. These are, think of them as no regret actions. They work across the board. So those would be the first things we implement, but then we're going to be looking for things that give us an indication of whether or not we're perhaps going towards a future that looks like scenario D. And for that future, as an example, there would be additional actions that we would need to take. So that's what we mean by adaptive management. It's implements actions to begin with, and then look and see where we're heading, and then start implementing additional actions as needed. Go ahead to the next phase, next slide. So our first finding regarding reliability, we had many conversations with the board, and the common theme there was we want to avoid, Metropolitan wants to avoid, or the region wants to avoid, retail water shortages and mandatory end use cutbacks. That was a general theme and general consensus on that. How we get there, of course, is very different. Each agency has their own unique challenges and opportunities that they have. And so what we found was there's different levels of tolerances based on, with respect to voluntary cutbacks prior to going into, maybe needing mandatory cutbacks. So all of that needs to be considered. But the common theme here is that regional success is that we are able to provide the consumer here in Southern California access to affordable, high quality water. Go ahead to the next slide. So with respect to the state water project dependent areas, this is not something that it was new to us necessarily, but because of we're seeing these unprecedented low state water project allocation years, 5%, 0%, 20% that we've experienced now. This really highlights the issue, and we're facing this issue today. And by that, I mean, there are areas in our service area that can only receive supplies from the state water project. We're seeing that is challenging for us, especially with these low allocations. The analysis in this IRP shows that this challenge continues into the future if we do not address it. So one of the key findings here is that we need to address this issue now. And work towards addressing this, because it's not going to go away. So it's generally considered, we solve the issue in the state water project dependent area. That is generally great for addressing the larger reliability issues across the region, Metropolitan's region. We also looked at or identified areas that we would want to further investigate in the implementation plan to address this challenge, and that is investments in the distribution system, for example, to be able to provide more access to Metropolitan's existing supplies to this area would be helpful. So enhancements in flexibility in our distribution system, and also maintaining the existing state water project supply reliability. Now, when I mean existing, I don't mean the current year's reliability or allocation or last year's allocation, which were very, very low. I mean the reliability that the department is saying that it can provide in its documentation or in its capability reports, and that's roughly a 50% or so allocation. So we want to maintain that. If we can do that, that will help in solving our reliability challenges in these areas. And also what we found is any action that we put into place in the implementation plan, whether it's building new storage, whether it's developing new supplies, that storage or those new supplies need to be accessible to the state water project dependent areas. Go ahead to the next slide. So with respect to demand management, we found our reliability is very sensitive to increases in demands. And it doesn't matter how those demands come about, whether it's from growth or whether it's from per capita use, it presents a major risk to our reliability. Demand management then helps to minimize potential growth in demand. So having a baseline conservation program will help in every scenario. I mentioned earlier that part of the implementation plan, the adaptive management plan, will be looking at robust actions. One robust action I think we can firmly state based on the analysis we've done to date, one of those robust actions or no regret action is something to do with a baseline at some level conservation programs and have those in place. But to go further, we need to be able to ramp those up and down. They need to be scalable and adaptable. So whether that means having the resources at hand, the knowledge base in-house to be able to do that, it also means the ability to pay for something like that. So we've done this in the past where we've responded to situations and ramped up and ramped down, but this I think solidifies going forward that we need to more formalize this process. Go ahead to the next slide. So with respect to findings related to the imported supplies, very susceptible, both the Colorado River supplies and our state water project supplies, susceptible to climate change and regulatory constraints. So we need to protect those existing imported supplies. There's a lot of uncertainty surrounding climate change, not necessarily that it's happening, but to what degree it will impact us. So we did look at a range of impacts in our analysis. And the same with regulatory constraints, a lot of uncertainty there as well. But we need to protect those existing imported supplies. That helps avoid investing in new supplies that we would need to develop, new supplies that can often be very costly. And so what we currently do with our imported supplies is we leverage them in conjunction with our storage programs. So it's consistent with this philosophy of big gulp, little sip. So when those supplies are available, we've already invested in being able to move those supplies when they're available into storage for use in drier years. And that is something that we found that we will need to continue doing to be able to manage through dry periods. Go ahead to the next slide. So speaking of storage, this is one of those tools that I think makes a Metropolitan quite unique, certainly here in the state of California, but throughout, I think, the United States. We've been able to manage through some significant droughts, multi-year droughts, because of the investments we made in storage. And again, in how we leverage those investments with our imported supplies and other demand management efforts, that we're able to store water in drier periods for use in, or store water in wetter periods for use in dry periods. So we found that we need to continue to do that going forward as part of our ability to manage through dry periods. Metropolitan storage portfolio, again, it's consistent with that philosophy, the big gulp, little sip. So absent any actions, we do know that we have some storage programs that will, basically their capabilities will decline. So there are some programs that the contracts will be up during this planning horizon. So that is something that we need to address. We've shown in our analysis that if those programs do sunset, that puts us at risk. We have greater reliability challenges. So we have opportunities to reimagine those programs through the new negotiations to continue them or maybe expand on them. That would be something that we want to investigate in the implementation plan. Go ahead to the next slide. And so also with local supply, we found that the region's reliability is heavily dependent on local supply production. Currently, local supplies account for about half of the region's water supply, so there's no way that it can't be part of our reliability picture going forward. And it's consistent with our IRP findings from the past and in the current one that it needs to be part of our solution set going forward. So maintaining existing local supplies and developing new local supplies is going to be important. Current local supply production and future supply development, we need to keep an eye on those things. There are certain assumptions we made in these scenarios. We know that they are impacted by climate change and regulatory constraints as well. So we need to monitor that. So this, again, is the foundation or the basis of one of the things we would want to be tracking as part of that adaptive management plan, as part of those signposts to see how well we're doing in maintaining existing local supplies and developing future or new supplies going forward. Go ahead to the next slide. So again, wrapping things up here with respect to the adaptive management plan, we acknowledge that there's a wide range of uncertainties. We've shown that in the scenarios, and we've shown how impactful even slight changes with assumptions on demands and with local production, how impactful that is to our reliability, both increasing reliability and decreasing reliability depending on those assumptions. So wide range of uncertainties. That's why we chose scenario planning. That's why we believe an adaptive management plan will be helpful to us in navigating through these uncertain times as we go forward. So each scenario warrants different sets of actions. And we're going to identify all those actions in the implementation plan. We'll take the common actions and start with those. And then have a set ready to go actions that we know we would need to implement should we see us moving towards one or another future. So this is what we meant by giving us a broader view of the future and giving us information basically as we move forward as to what programs and projects we would need to implement in order to maintain or achieve our reliability goal. Go ahead to the next slide. And so this should be our last slide here with respect to next steps. We are in the phase of finalizing our findings. What I gave you here today were the highlights of what we found through the analysis and the process that we've gone through over the last several months. We plan to review those draft final findings with the member agencies. They've had a chance to look at them. We have received their input. We've received input from the board as well. We're going to have another go at this with the member agencies to get further input and see where we're at with those. And then following that, we would return to the IRP committee for board adoption of those findings. And that, again, would be the deliverable for this first phase, this needs assessment phase of the IRP. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions, but that brings us to the end of this presentation.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. Are there any questions from the attendees?
I have a question if no one else does.
Oh, yes, of course. Director Cathy.
Now, yeah, thank you. So when you say long-term, what kind of horizon are you looking at?
25 years. The long-term was looking at towards the end of that 25-year horizon, that those are the reliability issues that we would be expecting given our analysis.
Yeah, okay. Where does the Delta fix and the tunnel play into all of this?
So those would be actions that the board may continue to support going forward. They would be supported by the findings here, actions like that, we want to maintain our existing reliability. That is one of the key findings with respect to imported supplies. So if the board feels like that is the tunnels or any other type of fix in the Delta or conveyance enhancements in the Delta supports that, I mean, if that's what they believe will support that, that would be consistent with our IRP findings. So it is supportive of that type of action.
Okay, and then I guess my last question is the demand from agriculture is become almost a fixed demand now, given the types of crops they're planting. How is that demand going to be reduced commensurate with urban demand?
So those demands, I'm guessing you mean outside of Metropolitan's or
Yes.
service area, right? Yeah. So the IRP,
and the federal project, yes.
Right. So the IRP doesn't necessarily address demand management at that level for those agencies, but it does consider the impacts of those demands on our imported supplies. So we do consider how those demands will impact us through what we receive through the reliability levels on the Colorado and also on the state.
Yeah, well, it is a net zero equation for sure. Have you heard, and last question, I'm sorry to monopolize all this stuff. Last question, I was reading there's a proposal by big ag companies up in the San Joaquin Valley to put a ballot measure on called Water Infrastructure Funding Act of 2022. Are you guys aware of that?
I personally don't have details on that. I don't know if others from Metropolitan, if Cathy has any insights on that.
Yes, Director, this is Cathy Biatella. I'm Metropolitan's Executive Legislative Representative. Nice to see you. Yes, we are aware of that. It is a citizens initiative to put it on the ballot to require that 2% of the general fund every year be dedicated towards funding water infrastructure projects until they get up to a certain number. I've forgotten the number of acre feet annually. It's going through the signature process right now to put it on a ballot. It's a pretty heavy lift because they've got to raise the money to do that. And I think they're behind at the moment, but they are working on that.
Well, they've got lots of money.
The hill may not be completely open.
I think to call it a citizens initiative is a little charitable.
I'd also say it's sort of a cavalier attitude. If we're not open for business come the end of February, early March in this town, then we got bigger problems on our hands than whether or not CASA can meet with members of Congress. I just find it hard to believe that they won't be open for business.
Yep, there we go. I apologize, Director Catherine.
Yes, and Director, when I say it's a citizens initiative, I'm just distinguishing it from legislative initiative.
I'm just pulling your chain. I understand. Believe me, I understand the political process.
Yes, indeed. It's ups and downs.
Anyway, well, I think it's a great exercise that you guys are doing. I commend you guys for doing it. Whatever part we can play in helping with groundwater storage and partnering with you guys, WRD is all in.
Really need some clarity on it.
President Williams, this is Devon with Metropolitan. If I might respond really quickly.
Of course.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So Director Catherman brought up a question about agricultural practices and ag water use in the state of California. And Dimitri's right that, you know, for the most part, what's happening with permanent agriculture is happening outside of our service areas. So it's not directly addressed by our integrated resources plan. But Director Catherman, I think much of what you are asking about is happening in the Central Valley, and we're seeing right before our eyes fundamental changes in the planning patterns where things are changing so that folks are looking at the land that they're managing and they are investing in permanent crops. You're seeing trees. You're even seeing vines that are being planted in areas where they weren't before. Some of these folks are considering the total land holdings they have and comparing that with the water supplies they have available, knowing that they'll shift quite a bit from year to year. And so they're keeping a portion of their land in year-to-year row crops, with the notion that they can cut that back in the years where the supplies are lower and prioritize their water use on those permanent crops. Other areas aren't adopting the same strategy, and I can tell you that the discussion around the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is starting to drive very real conversations there about what the long-term planning patterns and the long-term ability to sustain agriculture in those areas looks like. And you're probably aware of this, but certainly it's something we follow. But those discussions, you know, to some degree involve potential land retirements that could be close to 1 million acres of land. So it's definitely something that these folks are grappling with, and it's leading people to think about the implications of imported water supply stability as it relates to ag land use. They've got groundwater in many of these areas, and they've turned to that groundwater in previous years when imported water wasn't available. That's taxed the groundwater basins, and now they're coming to have to pay the piper at this point. So it's really leading to discussions about changes, again, in the long term. I mean, you know, starting now, but will likely lead to significant changes in the coming decades.
Yeah, thanks, Devon. Yeah, no. These are all good discussions, I think, and we need to start having them in a serious way.
Director LaFay has his hand up, EJ.
Go ahead, Director.
Thank you. We, following along with Director Catherman, how are you treating the regional recycled water program in the IRP? How does that enter?
I think I'm off mute. Right. So future projects such as this one that you're referring to is not directly in the IRP at this point. If it does proceed, we would factor the production from that going forward. But the findings, you'll find that our local supply finding does support development of new local supply. So something like this project, the regional recycling project, would definitely fit into something or supportive of that finding.
Yeah, it seems to me that that's similar to a number of other projects that are out there that look very promising, and but aren't, you know, they don't exist yet. So we have to figure out how that's going to work out. It sounds like I think I understand, and I guess we'll just wait and see what happens.
Well,
Yeah, and to be clear,
Director LaFay,
yeah.
you know, just another aspect of the regional recycle water program that's incredibly important is it's not only supporting local resources here in the region, but it's bringing that water directly to an area that needs it in a state water project dependent part of our service area, particularly in the main San Gabriel Valley. And when we look at the conditions that we've seen over the last 2 years and now going into 2022, it leads us to conclude that if we had that project in place now, we would not have had to have declared an emergency just 3 weeks ago as a result of the tremendously dry state water project conditions. So we view it as one of the options that will be analyzed in the implementation portion of the IRP. But keep in mind, we are moving forward with the environmental work, and we'll be bringing a go, no-go decision to your board in 2024. We're actively working on lining up funding to make that decision easier for you as a board. So our view is that that particular program has great promise for us.
That is a very, very great observation. It never even occurred to me that that water is going to go to the San Gabriel Valley and reduce our underserved agencies. That's the first time I've heard that. I don't need a whole lot of persuasion to help me support that program, but that's a whole new thing that sounds extremely important to us. Thanks, Devon.
So Devon, when you're going up to San Gabriel, just drop a little off in our spreading grounds on the way.
Understood.
Well, thank you all for the questions. And of course, Dimitri, thank you for the presentation and answers. Before we go on to our next item, I did want to note that West Basin's Director Scott Houston has joined the meeting. He actually joined it just before the original presentation, but we wanted to make sure that we introduced him here today. That does provide us with a quorum. The next item that we have is item 4B under our agenda. And for this item, I did want to note that obviously Metropolitan Water District's government affairs, whether it's local, state, and federal, has always been the top of the industry and always working hard to crowd the member agencies and really make sure that we have a united voice up there in Sacramento and Washington, D.C. And for this presentation, we do have a legislative update by Cathy Biatella, the Executive Legislative Representative for Metropolitan Water District. Cathy, thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, EJ, and thank you for that kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to be with you today. So as many of you know, we are about to start the second year of a 2-year session. They'll come back into the legislature at the beginning of January. And right now is the time of the year when members are really putting together their legislative proposals and packages. And we'll see if this year, like the past two, is going to be shaped by the pandemic, which they've had a limited number of bills. Last year it was 12 bills. We'll see what they do this year. They're continuing to meet remotely for the foreseeable future, and there will be limits on numbers of hearing rooms. So we may see another limit on bill packages. But despite all that, a lot has really happened in the past year, and a lot is happening too politically. As a lot of you know, there's the redistricting that's going on, and by the end of the month we may see those new maps, and that is beginning to kind of collide with term limits that really will take effect in a significant number of members in 2024. And so we may start to see some early departures as a result of the redistricting, where members may feel like it will be difficult to run for re-election. So there's going to be a lot of churn, I think, in the coming year, and we'll just keep an eye on that and keep everyone informed. So next slide, please. So before I turn to 22, I think it's really important we acknowledge the historic state budget that was made possible by the surplus this year and the federal COVID-19 relief funds that California received. So there were several budget bills this year. Unlike years past, there was so much money they had to actually authorize it through many bills, but there was a remarkable $15 billion authorized in a climate resilience package, and you can see here what that entailed. As you know, Metropolitan focused significantly on advocating for increased funding for water infrastructure and COVID assistance this past year. So we were more than pleased with the $5.2 billion for water and drought resilience, plus the $1 billion for COVID-19 relief that went to the water agencies. The $5.2 billion includes funding for safe drinking water and septic to sewer conversions with a priority on disadvantaged communities. And then there's funding for recycled water, groundwater replenishment, PFAS assistance, and urban and multi-benefit drought relief projects. And this funding, the drought relief funding, can be used for demand management, and that was thanks to our sort of collective efforts. So next slide, please. So looking ahead, by all accounts, the state is going to have another healthy surplus. Right now, the Legislative Analyst Office is forecasting a $31 billion surplus. And on the federal side, there's significant dollars coming to California that can be used to pay for recycled water projects, water and energy efficiency, dam repairs, and clean drinking water. So the combination with last year's budget action and the surplus that's ahead the legislature's probably not going to prioritize legislation that would put a climate resilience bond on the ballot. I have heard some talk that the authors of the climate resilience bonds that were held over from last year may try to move them at the beginning of the year, but I think overall leadership may decide, with the funding that they have in hand, it's better not to incur debt and do a climate resilience bond on the ballot in 2022. That said, we have a tremendous opportunity to make progress on a backlog of projects with this year's surplus in the federal funding, and hopefully Congress will pass the Build Back Better Act and with additional long-term funding programs. The timing could not be more critical as we face this drought, and we can plainly see its impact, the impacts of climate change on our water resources. And we know we're behind, so we need to adapt the water systems and build on the new water supply projects while we manage through the current drought. But what's making this difficult, and in fact exacerbates the challenge for all of us, is that we've got to conserve the water supplies to get through this drought. And I don't need to tell all of you that lower water supplies means less revenue for the projects and operational adjustments we need to adapt to these changed conditions. So at Metropolitan, we will aggressively be pursuing state and federal funding to help invest in our water projects for this region and help stave off rate impacts to you all. And we will be seeking funding assistance for Metropolitan from the state in support of our priorities, including the Regional Recycled Water Program, that align with the governor's climate resilience priorities. And we'll be sending a letter to the governor accordingly. But in addition, in light of these budget surpluses, we will convene a meeting with the member agency managers soon and with staff. And we want to update our shovel-ready infrastructure project list that we put together last year so we can accurately describe the needs of the region and advocate, both on behalf of Metropolitan as well as our member agencies and your priorities. So budget surpluses are rare, and we need to take advantage of this moment and to make our hidden infrastructure more visible to our legislators. And that's a challenge. But we need them to understand that water is one of the most impacted resources under climate change, and it is and always has been vital, to the lives and the livelihoods in our region. So next slide, please. So looking ahead to legislation, I think if we continue to have a dry year, then the drought and water supply will be the focus. We anticipate Assemblymember Friedman will want to move her bill AB 1434 to lower indoor water use standards based on a study by DWR and the State Water Board. The final study was recently released and presented to the legislature last month. And as some of you know, it recommends keeping the indoor standard at 55 gallons per capita per day until 2023, and then it's going to decline to 47 by 2025 and 42 by 2030. So this is a significant decrease. These new standards will be implemented at the water supplier level and not apply to individual customers. But as you know, retail water agencies strongly opposed the bill last year when it was introduced and will do so again this year, I presume. And one of the reasons is because DWR and the State Water Board, the study did not properly analyze how changing the standard will impact water and wastewater management. And that includes potable water use, wastewater recycling and reuse systems, infrastructure operations, and supplies. And right now, Aqua has a work group that's considering legislative options to address their concerns, including allowing an agency to seek a variance from the state if a lower standard would be detrimental to water and wastewater management. And at the same time, additional funding will be sought in this year's budget to pay for conservation rebates. And I know that CMUA is working on such a funding request, and I'm sure Aqua will be as well. So non-functional turf is another legislative proposal that's under discussion, and Eastern Municipal Water District proposed legislation to require a statewide study of non-functional turf and to explore options for phasing out its use on public right-of-ways. And Eastern had presented the bill to Aqua to co-sponsor, but the state legislative committee decided to hold off and has now formed a work group that is exploring options to how best to advance such a proposal. And one consideration that's under discussion right now is legislation that would grant an urban retail water supplier the authority to prohibit uses of water that are non-essential during non-emergencies. And this could include watering of non-functional turf. And we recently had a discussion in the last couple of weeks that are looking at the existing water code to see if that's feasible anyway. So the lawyers are looking at that as well. So a lot of discussion is underway about this issue, which I think was the intent of Eastern, to really begin to put a spotlight on this particular use of water. So looking at regional water infrastructure broadly, I've mentioned that we plan to work with your agencies, to update the shovel-ready project list. But in addition to that, Metropolitan plans to sponsor legislation that would authorize us to use alternative delivery methods for the design and construction of the regional recycled water program and a select number of drought-related projects, which you may hear about later by Devon, but have been discussed at the Metropolitan Board. And this legislation we're looking to introduce, it's really modeled after a bill last year that was enacted and signed by the governor, which was SB 626 by Senator Dodd, that provided similar authorities to the Department of Water Resources to do operations maintenance on the state water project. So in addition, related to infrastructure, Aqua has a proposal that would address the recent California Supreme Court decision in Canana versus Barrett Business Services. And some of you may be aware of this, but that decision created uncertainty and ambiguity regarding the type of work that performed by irrigation districts or utilities that is subject to prevailing wage law. And the decision upended a decades-long understanding that the law applied to construction type work and not operational work. So now a broad application of prevailing wage potentially triggers numerous requirements for utilities, including mandatory procurement and contract provisions, registration with the Department of Industrial Relations, and required prevailing wage rates. So Aqua's bill is proposing to clarify which type of work is subject to prevailing wage. And as many of you know, the Colorado River watershed is in a prolonged drought, and the South Basin states have been working on a plan to conserve 500,000 acres or more to restore water levels in Lake Mead and stave off future water rationing among the lower basin states. And it's also possible that legislation that addresses environmental compliance may be needed to support California's part in that agreement. So that may be something we see coming forward, whether it's in a policy bill or some other effort by the state. So next slide, please. We also should expect to see legislation move on water affordability and water quality, and rates are increasing to meet the needs of a 21st century water management system, and this will have an impact on low-income households. So Senator Dodd's bill, introduced last year, SB 222, would create a statewide low-income water rate assistance program. It was placed on the inactive file, and the administration wanted to weigh in. But one of the key issues to moving this bill forward will be to identify a reliable funding source to pay for the program that doesn't place the burden on water agencies who are working to keep rates affordable. And turning to water quality, Metropolitan and CMUA have sponsored a bill, SB 230, authorized by Senator Portantino, to address new contaminants in drinking water that we are now able to detect down to parts per trillion. And these new contaminants can include algal toxins and pharmaceuticals and other chemicals that show up in our drinking water sources. And we need a better way to prioritize them for regulatory action based on their occurrence and their risk to public health. The bill is in a Senate appropriations. It's a 2-year bill, and it was held over from last year. And we're working on amendments with the author's office that seek to address some concerns that were raised by the NGOs when the bill was heard in the Senate Environmental Quality Committee, and Senator Allen asked us to work on. So the bill's going to have to pass out of the Senate to the Assembly if it's to remain viable next year. And so we'll be working on moving that. And you will see some amendments in print fairly soon. And then I recently learned that Central Basin plans to introduce legislation to set up a framework for ensuring that the condition of the Central Basin's water quality and reliability is prioritized for funding by the State Water Resources Control Board. And their proposal right now is looking at mapping or requiring that the State Water Board map contaminated aquifers, analyze at-risk water systems, and prioritize infrastructure for funding on risk, based on risk, to ensure that there's a safe and reliable supply for their service area. So next slide, please. So funding for subsidence repairs to state and federal conveyance infrastructure and Senator Hurtado's bill, SB 559, that was introduced last year and now is a 2-year bill, is likely to come back. Parts of the California aqueduct that conveys water to Southern California has been damaged by subsidence from groundwater pumping. And this is resulting in about a 15 to 30 million increase in operational cost to move water south. So 559 is proposing to create a fund that upon appropriation would help defray the cost of the repairs and was supported by the state and federal contractors. And Metropolitan and the contractors were thankful that the legislature did authorize in the budget this year $200 million for subsidence repairs, and DWR has already announced the release of the first $100 million of that. And it's going to repair damages to the California aqueduct and then 2 federal projects, the Delta Mendota Canal and the Frank Kern Canal. So any assistance from the state is welcome because it helps defray the cost to ratepayers, and we will continue to look for more money in the budget to cover those costs. And then focusing in on the water energy nexus, energy reliability, as all of you know, has become an issue the last couple of years as we've seen brownouts on record hot days over the summer and in the fall. And in response to that, the state has relied on the state water project to provide backup energy at a cost to the contractors. And the Resources Agency is also wrapping up a report, the SB 49 report, on how to incorporate renewables into the state water project. So while these are important statewide policy goals, the contractors are now looking to ensure that these costs that are producing, public benefits are not necessarily borne by the contractor family, but also could be borne by the state, through general fund appropriations or some other funding mechanism. And long duration energy storage that's needed so that renewables can power, the grid on 24/7 is another statewide policy priority. And there have been several attempts over the last couple of years that would require the state to procure long duration energy storage, either at the expense of ratepayers, regardless of who benefits, or through the Department of Water Resources because they performed a similar role during the energy crisis. And last year, the administration had a renewable energy package that they wanted to introduce that included long duration energy storage. And they wanted to propose it as a budget trailer bill, but they were not able to get support from leadership for introducing it. So we may see something come back in a different form this year, but I think this is issue going to come up again. And then turning to governance, Three Valleys Municipal Water District, some of you may have followed this. They had a bill last year, AB 703, that would allow local agencies to hold teleconference board meetings during non-emergencies. If you remember, AB 361 was enacted, but you actually have to, it's only when there is a state emergency and you actually have to demonstrate that there's a need to be physically distanced because of a pandemic, for example. Their bill would be during a non-emergency, and they're working on version sort of 2.0 of the bill after having talked with the Assembly local government committee staff so that their bill comes alongside AB 361 and doesn't conflict in any way. And so that really covers, what I see right now as some of the big policy issues that may come forward. Like I said, I think the drought will open up more discussions. The legislature will be looking for things it may do to help alleviate and mitigate the impacts of the drought. We have been contacted by members who are starting to ask questions about that. So this is not by any means a comprehensive list, but it's sort of an overview right now of what are things that are on the table, and there's likely to be more to come. So I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Director Lefebvre, did you have another question?
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. So what does long duration energy storage mean? Is that batteries or pumped hydro or both, or what does it mean?
Well, in the definition, it can be both, Director Lefebvre, but in this context, what they were looking at specifically were pump back hydro projects. So supporting, San Diego has a proposed project.
Yeah, I know that.
There's the Eagle Crest project. So the bills, the ones that were proposed, envisioned those projects.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have any further questions? Seeing and hearing none, President Williams, if you don't mind, I'll move us on to our next item. It's our third and final presentation for today. It is item 5A under MWD Other Matters, and today we have an update on water supply conditions and other MWD-related issues by Devon and Pottier, the Assistant General Manager and Executive Manager at Metropolitan Water District.
Go ahead.
Hey, thank you, President Williams, and thanks, EJ, for the introduction. And I know we're pushing the time limit here, so I'll be very brief instead of giving a presentation. Our board next week has a really packed agenda, and it is an example of the breadth of issues that we deal with at Metropolitan all in 1 month here on this agenda. We're going to be focusing in on major Colorado River issues, and this will be part of the discussion for those of you that will be attending the Colorado River Users Conference that's happening next week. We'll be there, and it's going to come right on the heels of us asking our board to approve a new agreement related to Colorado River issues. It is being referred to as the 500+ plan. The reason for this agreement is because earlier this year, and you all know, the federal government declared an official shortage on the Colorado River because of the levels in Lake Mead. This is a shortage for the lower Colorado River basin. And we are affected by that if Lake Mead levels continue to drop. From where they are right now, they would need to drop by roughly another 30 feet in elevation before it would start to affect water available to Metropolitan. And so we got together with Southern Nevada Water Authority, Central Arizona Project, and the Arizona Department of Water Resources. And we talked about whether there were additional actions that we could take to try to bolster the water levels in Lake Mead. And that's what led to this discussion about a 500+ plan. And the idea here is that by the end of 2022, we will take actions that end up resulting in more than 500,000 acre-feet of additional water being left in Lake Mead. And then by the end of 2023, actions that lead to another 500,000 acre-feet. So over this 2-year period, 1 million acre-feet. The focus of these actions is to be able to keep the levels in Lake Mead above 1,020 feet above mean sea level. Right now it's about 1070 in that range. And so to give you a sense, that's what we're trying to protect. If it were to drop to those levels, you'd be seeing significant impacts to power production from Hoover. You would also be seeing significant reductions in water available to Arizona, California, and Nevada. So part of this plan involves funding. Arizona, with the most at stake, will be putting the most funding into the pot. Arizona Department of Water Resources will provide $40 million. Central Arizona Project will provide 20. Southern Nevada Water Authority is coming in for 20 million. And we are suggesting to our board next week that we also contribute 20 million. That's over the next 2 years. That creates a pot of $100 million. And we've secured a commitment from the federal government, who will also sign on to this agreement, that they will find $100 million for the Bureau to match the funding from the states. So the total pot is $200 million. Then what we'll do is we'll be seeking voluntary participants to reduce their water use, including on-farm programs. We expect that with the alfalfa market the way it is, that there will be ample opportunity to get farmers to fallow land and to allow us to keep that water in Lake Mead for the benefit of the system, resulting in higher levels in Lake Mead as a result. So that's a very general description of the plan that the board will be hearing about next week. If the board approves it, then there will be signing ceremonies at the Colorado River Users Conference, including the federal government as part of that, signing on to this plan to help preserve some of the levels in Lake Mead. That's really one of the big items that's there. You heard Dimitri and Cathy talk about some drought projects that we're pursuing to be able to move water up into our state water project dependent areas. We will be asking the board to approve adding 2 of those projects to our capital program on Monday. And we're also pursuing some exchange deals. One of these exchange deals is actually with the San Diego County Water Authority. The Water Authority invested in storage in the semi-tropic program in the Central Valley many years ago. And we will be tapping into a portion of the storage they can make available to us, and that will move to our state water project dependent areas. So that's another action item. We've got another item that is a similar deal with San Bernardino Valley Municipal Water District, where we'll be able to tap into some supplies they have available in the state water project. And finally, funding. We are also asking the board to approve resolutions in support of 2 grants that we had applied for with the state of California. One is $7.5 million for turf removal, and the other is $2.5 million to be able to continue a program we've been running with SoCal Gas Company, where they're the face of the program. They focus on energy saving investments in disadvantaged communities. It's a direct install program. We piggyback on that program to help install high efficiency clothes washers and other water saving devices. So long as they're going into someone's home, we piggyback on that program to see if we can do direct installs of other water saving devices. Those are just a few of the things that are on the docket next week, and I know we're time starved, so I'll leave it at that and answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Devon. Do we have any questions? I do recognize that we're just past 1:30, so I thank you for the brevity. President Williams, it looks like we do not have any questions.
I see. So this is your last chance. So hearing none, then we should move on to the next part of the agenda.
And President Williams, the next item on our agenda is item 6, adjournment.
I don't see any objections. We are now adjourned.
All right.